Welcome back to LoyalTV. This week we're in Oklahoma City to meet a group of musicians who made Oklahoma a hotbed for jazz music.
Oklahoma in the national mindset is OU football, oil, and the musical Oklahoma. So jazz is not the first thing that comes to mind when people think of Oklahoma. But if they were to look into the history and learn about the strength and development of Black history here in the state, then they would learn more about the number of jazz musicians who came from Oklahoma. And the list is quite long. And not only that, but some of the titans of jazz came from Oklahoma. The Oklahoma City Blue Devils came out of a really rich jazz scene in Oklahoma in the late 1920s and early 1930s. One of the things about being a musician in Oklahoma during that time was that it was a way out. It was a way to make some money. It was a way to go somewhere else. In addition to that, there were a lot of schools in that segregated era that had music programs. And so you had young musicians who were able to study music formally. And that's one of the interesting things about the jazz musicians that come out of Oklahoma. We didn't have quite as many blues musicians that came from the state. And one of the things that I think is the reason for this is because the musicians were trained formally. They could read sheet music. And as a result of that, a lot of these musicians had opportunities in these territory bands who could go around and play all sorts of different styles. But it was still a segregated era, and so you can't put too much gold on it. The thing about the segregated era was that the Black communities were really strong in themselves. And so there were middle class and upper middle class African American environments in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and Muskogee that provided markets for musicians to come play in.
Formed in 1923, they traveled with Billy King's Vaudeville Roadshow out of the Aldridge Theater in Oklahoma City. While trombonist Ermir Bucket Coleman had more control over the band, it was Walter Page who conceived the musical arrangements. So when the Billy King Roadshow disbanded in 1925, it was Page who renamed the group. Many remember it as Walter Page's original Blue Devils, but others called it the Oklahoma City Blue Devils.
A Blue Devil was a sort of farm or ranch worker who dealt with barbed wire, is one of the stories that I've heard. But of course, the whole concept of the blues and Blue Devils goes way back in music history. The whole idea of having the blues and singing the blues makes you feel better. It's like a cathartic cry. And so I think all those things tie together to come up with this Oklahoma City Blue Devils name. A number of very significant jazz musicians played with the Blue Devils. To start with, Oklahoma City's Jimmy Rushing, who was known as a primary jazz vocalist in the middle 20th century. Lester Young, the great saxophone player, played in the group. Don Byas, another great saxophone player, played in the group. And one of the most underrated trumpet players of all time, Orrin Hot Lips Page, also played in the band. So when these groups would travel around the Great Plains, from Nebraska, south down to Texas, New Mexico, over to maybe Arkansas, they would often get involved in cutting contests where they would have a battle of the bands and they would let the applause of the crowd say which band was better. And the Oklahoma City Blue Devils were always a great battle of the bands band. They'd often win these contests. And so the reason for this is they had all these great players in them.
Even though the Blue Devils were becoming one of the biggest bands in the region, Oklahoma City was always the home they returned to.
So the Blue Devils would have played in a couple of places. The Little Page Hotel was not only where they stayed and ate, but there was also a ballroom there, and so they played there. And then also the Aldridge Hotel is another spot that they would have played, but that would have been home base for them. And they would have traveled from there north and south.
Despite their popularity, not much of their music or performance was documented.
The thing about the Oklahoma City Blue Devils is they are, in some sense, mythological. because we only have 2 recordings from them, both of which were made in 1929, and they sound almost like period pieces. Nothing like what I imagine the band would sound like, which would be closer to what something like the Count Basie Orchestra evolves into because of the recording techniques at the time and what was perceived as popular music at the time. So when we think about the Oklahoma City Blue Devils, we think about this great territory band that could outplay just about anybody, but we don't have any audio record beyond these 2 songs. And so they really stand as sort of a mythical group, similar to someone like Robert Johnson in the blues world. I think seeing the Oklahoma City Blue Devils in 1928, 1929 would be a revelatory experience, whereas music of that period had to carry itself through its own volume. So there weren't PA systems. And that's why the horn groups really were so successful, is they could fill the room. Not only that, but there was no amplification for the guitar at that time. And so the guitar was just a corded instrument that was used for rhythm. So to see the Oklahoma City Blue Devils in the late 1920s, early 1930s, I think would have been a very soulful experience. And that music would have hit you right here in the chest and inspired you to keep on going, because that's why we like to listen to music, is it either keeps us in a good mood or puts us in a good mood if we're in a bad mood. And I think the Blue Devils certainly would have done that. Walter Page, who was essentially the band leader, dies. And once he dies, the band starts to fall apart. However, since Count Basie is part of this environment and he knows these players, he knows that he can form a band with the nucleus of the Blue Devils and keep going. And so that's what he does. The remainder of the band goes to Kansas City, becomes the Count Basie Orchestra, and they take off from there.
The Oklahoma City Blue Devils were inducted into the Oklahoma Music Hall of Fame in 2000 to celebrate their legacy and honor the role they played in jazz history. Swing back around next time for more LoyalTV and the best Oklahoma stories you've never heard.